You ever do your homework back in school and you're so proud of the work you put into it and you hand it in and your teacher says, "This isn't right," and then goes back on previous work and says, "You know what, you're wrong on this too." Well, welcome to my world, in the world of CFL Trade Trees, and thanks to Jamie Nye, the sports guy, I am re-recording this and possibly taking down a previous trade tree. And if you're active on Twitter, please go to my Twitter feed at Dalts to see what the whole thing is about. Today, we're going to show you how the demise of the Ottawa Renegades led to a dynasty in Rider Nation and even led to a stud receiver on their current roster. So for all intents and purposes, I'm going to leave that video up just because I don't feel like doing a lot of it all over again. But I'll touch on a lot of things here. In 2005, the Elks won their second last Grey Cup. The Renegades were under very poorly mismanagement, and which led to the folding, the second time in 10 years that an Ottawa team in the CFL was folded, which led to a dispersal draft. And again, we've covered this. There's just one little tiny bit of smidge of information that you just need to know the right people. So the initial trade was to the Hamilton Tiger Cats, Corey Holmes, Scott Gordon, and a 2007 first-round pick in the 2007 college draft in the CFL. In return, Saskatchewan got they got the first overall pick in the dispersal draft and another player, but we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But in the 2007 CFL draft, the Hamilton Tiger Cats selected defensive lineman J.P. Bakaziak, and he was a very reliable depth player. Didn't amount to a huge amount, and he eventually left towards the Montreal Alouettes via free agency, so that is done. The Hamilton Tiger Cats, as I alluded to, also actually got Scott Gordon, safety. Back in the day, they would have called it non-import. But today, he's considered a national, and which makes him almost an 100,000-aire by default. Scott Gordon didn't play that much with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and was eventually traded back to Saskatchewan in exchange for his round pick in the 2007 CFL draft. That pick, the Tiger Cats selected Adam Kanya, who played 3 games in the CFL, and they were all in 2008. So that ends there. Holmes, what can we say about Corey Holmes? He was a dynamic returner, running back, receiver, just not with Hamilton. And in 2007, Corey Holmes was packaged with a rookie receiver by the name of Chris Getzlaff and sent back to Saskatchewan in exchange for Jason Armstead, who barely finish the season before moving on to multiple teams a year later. Get to the Saskatchewan side of things, just keep in mind that Hamilton gave up probably what everybody would have known as a top-tier quarterback, and now after all this is said and done on their side, they have nothing. J.P. Bakaziak for a few years, and that was pretty much nothing. And you look at the Hamilton Tiger Cats record throughout the 2006 and 07 season, and you kind of understand how they got there by moves like this. Now let's go to Saskatchewan side of things. Now we know that first overall pick in the 2006 dispersal draft was quarterback Kerry Joseph. We know what he did. MOP in 07, Grey Cup in 07, and then he was traded. Now, we've talked about this trade numerous times, so I'm not really going to go into anything as far as depth and knowledge in this. But the Riders ended up with 1 year of Glenn January, a couple of games with Ronald Flemons, Keith Shulgin for a few years, and after a few trades, they ended up with receiver Jeremy Sisko, who didn't play that much, and Shamari Williams, who left for free agency before trading for him again a few years after that. So that's it. You could argue that based on this trade, even on Hamilton's side of things, that the Hamilton Tiger Cats created a dynasty for the Saskatchewan Roughriders because, well, they won the Grey Cup in 07. And they had a player in Chris Getzlaff that gave back to Saskatchewan, who was part of the 09, 2010, and 2013 Grey Cup runs with the Grey Cup title in Saskatchewan in 2013. But if only there was a way to make this great trade tree better in Saskatchewan. There was. And this is why you need to double check your work, fact check every nook and cranny on the internet, because there was a player that was traded with Kerry Joseph, and his name was Darian Durant. That's right. The Saskatchewan Roughriders got two of their face of the franchise quarterbacks in this one deal. So you could argue that the demise of the Ottawa Renegades created this huge dynasty in Saskatchewan. Darian Durant's time didn't really necessarily get started until 2 years after this trade, and it ended almost ended before it started because, well, injuries happened. Marcus Crandall down, Stephen Giles down, Darian Durant, okay, you can argue that maybe it shouldn't have started at that point. It ended to the point where the Saskatchewan Roughriders had to trade for Michael Bishop, of all people. Now, Darian Durant comes back in 2009, first full year as starter, Grey Cup. Grey Cup again in 2010, runners up to the Montreal Alouettes. Now, the next 6 years could be argued that they would be tumultuous time in Riderville, between the too many men throwing a game-solving interception to hand the Grey Cup title to the Montreal Alouettes, F off on social media, and let's not forget the two season-ending injuries in 2014 and 2015, and oh yeah, the Chris Jones era. But all that is on the backside because he got to do the one thing that not too many people can do. Not only hoist the Grey Cup, but do it on home soil. Only 4 teams are able to do that in modern CFL history, and Darian Durant got to do it. And then that was short-lived because in 2016, after the 2016 season, he was traded. Now, I should say that his rights were traded, so when you look at this particular trade, you could say that Saskatchewan didn't get that much for him, and you would be right. His time in Montreal only lasted 1 year, and he actually, after looking back at it, that was his last time playing in the CFL. After signing the contract with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, shortly before the 2018 season, he announced his retirement. So Montreal didn't get too much out of this. Hamilton didn't get too much out of the trade tree, but we know what Saskatchewan got, and it gets better. The rights to Darian Durant were traded in exchange for a 4th-round pick in 2017 and a conditional pick in 2018. Now, the 4th-round pick was used to select offensive lineman Eddie Meredith, who hasn't played a game in the CFL, but that branch is technically still open. Now, his rights are still with Saskatchewan, and this isn't on level with the fact that, in the late and mid-90s, where teams drafted a dead guy. But all intents and purposes, Eddie Meredith pretty much retired from the sport of football, contracted a virus or a serious disease that made him cut weight. And when you're an offensive lineman losing that much weight and you're not wanting to, it's pretty disastrous. So you pretty much called it quits without actually calling it quits. So this branch is still open in this trade tree. The other one, well, I mentioned that was Darian Durant's rights because he was still technically a free agent. Now, because Montreal did sign Darian Durant, those conditions, they were met. And there was an upgraded to a 2nd-round pick in the 2018 draft, which Saskatchewan didn't use. Why? Because they traded that pick the year after. The Saskatchewan Roughriders send a 2018 2nd-round pick to the Hamilton Tiger Cats, taking advantage of Hamilton again, in exchange for quarterback Zach Collaros. I find it funny that throughout this whole trade tree, Saskatchewan just loved acquiring on this side quarterbacks. Kerry Joseph, Darian Durant, and now Zach Collaros. Now, his time in Riderville in 2018 wasn't something that you would look back and say, hey, remember this, those good old days? No, because Zach Collaros had undergone a lot of pounding. He wasn't the 2015 Collaros, and some people actually expected this. third play in the 2019 season sealed his fate.
And the first down for the Rough Riders. Colaros, he'll pull it down, take off, and a feet first slide did take a hit from Simone Lawrence.
Zach Colaros is slow to get up.
And clearly a headshot.
Well, the good news is that the Saskatchewan Roughriders had a backup plan in Cody Fajardo, who took the reins and never looked back. And a month before the CFL trade deadline, the Riders made another trade. They had sent Zach Colaros to the Toronto Argonauts in exchange for a 4th-round pick in 2020. Now, the 2020 season didn't happen because, well, COVID, so we don't necessarily learn what the Saskatchewan Roughriders were getting with that particular pick. But this year we did. The Saskatchewan Roughriders, with the 2020 4th-round pick, select receiver Kian Schaffer-Baker. It's early, 4 games played, 25 catches, 259 yards through the air, and 1 touchdown, which just happened recently. It is extremely early, but I'm not wrong to say that the Saskatchewan Roughriders got a stud receiver. Probably their nominee for most outstanding Canadian and most outstanding rookie. You still got a ways to go. But to think that the Saskatchewan Roughriders gave up Scott Gordon, a 1st-round pick, and Corey Holmes, only to get the two of those players back, get Kerry Joseph, get Darren Durant, Zach Colaros, and now have Kian Schaffer-Baker, shake and bake, as the Rider fans call them. The Saskatchewan Roughriders made out like bandits. This is an absolutely crazy trade tree after I fact checked. It remains to be. And let's not forget the fact that they had a few years of guys like Keith Sholigan, Glenn January, and a couple of games of Ronald Flemings throughout this mix. It is still crazy to think how great asset management, rider management had throughout this 15 years of this trade tree. And with Eddie Meredith still laying ablaze, and with the Eddie Meredith still laying around, and Kian Schaffer-Baker just not even close to entering his prime, this trade tree is still open. And who knows what the Saskatchewan Roughriders can do. We'll do it for this week's video. If you have any comments and see how much I screwed up this trade tree, leave a comment below. And again, feel free to like and subscribe so that anytime that we actually upload any content, it goes directly to your account. And if you have any future suggestions for trade trees, hit them up on Twitter, myself at Rouge Dalts, podcast at Rouge Radio. And of course, this video is powered by the Canadian Football Podcast Network. You reach the CF Pod Network on Twitter.